Hey, welcome in, everyone. Dom Giordano with you. And breaking story this afternoon, after about 10 weeks and a ton of testimony, we have the verdict in the Dr. Kermit, hard to use the term, Dr. Gosnell case from West Philadelphia, in which he's been convicted of 3 counts of homicide and 1 count of manslaughter. The 3 homicide, the 3 babies. 1, the jury rejected it. There was a hung jury on a couple of accounts, and I believe on 200-odd other technical accounts, they have found guilty with this, and now we move on to the penalty phase. Joining us to break down some of that in studio is Dan Gross, principal in Gross Communications, and joining us is top-flight criminal defense attorney Bob Levant. Hey, Bob, welcome to Dom Time. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Hey, thanks for having me, Dom. Good to hear from you.
Well, Bob, tell me what jumps out of this in your mind about how this played out. Did you think there was any hope I wasn't in the courtroom, but based upon what I was able to read and all the guests we brought on, there were just a multitude of witnesses toward this. Is there anything that jumps out at you that you might have done differently as a defense attorney?
No, I think to me, even more than the witnesses, the physical evidence, and for anybody that was in the courtroom, they had set up the treatment room in the courtroom with Dr. Gosnell's actual equipment, and it was an eerie sight for the jurors. The photographs of not only the fetuses, of course, but the interior of his clinic was, to me, spoke volumes more than even the cooperating witnesses who had worked inside the clinic. And of course, I think Dr. Gosnell was his own worst enemy from the moment that the agents came to his facility. He behaved in a very, very bizarre manner. He was he was carrying around food for his pets, and he was eating while he was talking to the agents, who claimed that he had blood stains in and around the office. So it was graphic and disturbing testimony, and I think that was harder to overcome than even the witnesses themselves.
What about the penalty phase now? I mean, I just see Philadelphia juries on the side of this almost never coming up with a death penalty in something like this. What do you think plays out? I mean, we hear that there's an offer. The defense attorney McMahon is saying something to the effect of, if you give us the life imprisonment, we will say we won't appeal. Would a DA go for something like that?
Dom, a lot of this, unfortunately, comes down to dollars and cents. And from the district attorney's perspective, I can certainly understand considering that, given the amount of money that it takes to litigate beyond the penalty phase through all of the layers of appeals, and given Dr. Gosnell's age, which I believe is 72, and the fact that since we reinstated the death penalty in Pennsylvania, there's been no one executed except for 2 folks that had volunteered, that it's highly unlikely to, I would say almost impossible, that Dr. Gosnell would ever face execution.
All right, let me push back on that a little bit, Bob, and say, though, but here we portrayed a guy as a monster. Remember, Cameron, one of the chief prosecutors, walks over to him dramatically and says, "Are you human?" in the closing arguments. And yet you can still come back after all that and say to the public, because the DA's office is a political office, well, I did the best I could, but given all these legal difficulties, we're going to decide not to go for the death penalty.
Well, I certainly understand that, but District Attorney Seth Williams has also been, pragmatic in his approach to a lot of things, and I think that if he were to make that decision, I don't think that the citizens would hold it against him. And I would say this, from a trial lawyer perspective, without getting too technical for your viewing audience, when you do seek the death penalty against someone, the members who are selected for that jury have to be folks who say they would be able to impose the death penalty in some set of circumstances, which generally leads to a more conservative jury, and some think one that leans more toward guilt in the guilt-innocence phase. So from a trial lawyer perspective, I would say, kudos to the district attorney's office, and if they decide to take it off the table, that's not an inappropriate decision.
All right, so they possibly are using this because if you have to be death penalty able and certified, it's likely that you would be more conservative. I would agree with you.
And I would say, that's certainly a a fact that's available to the district attorney as an advocate, and if they utilized it in that way and then turned around and said, this man will never ever get out of prison, he's waived his appellate rights, and we've saved the taxpayers, millions of dollars that can be put to some good to try to prevent this, I can understand that. I can understand where he'd be coming from if in fact they were considering that. I don't know if they are, but it has been reported.
We're talking with Bob Levant here on Dom Time with Dan Gross in studio. Let me ask you, Bob, parting question, and do you see any legs with this, with the Gosnell decision having any impact beyond just what has been circumscribed by today's decision technically and legally? Is there anything that you see coming out of this as far as policy, legal policy, something that would defense attorneys or prosecutors look at and hear strategically? Is there any significance?
Well, I think that there's going to be a complete, and there has been some talk of an overhaul of the way that the state was overseeing the facilities that do these kind of procedures. And I definitely think that that is an area where this case is going to have some legs. Some of them in the legal battle, but a lot more, I think, in the legislative arena. That's likely to, and it certainly reinvigorated the national debate on a lot of things in this area. So that's my thoughts on that.
Thank you, Bob Levant. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Don.
You're welcome. Criminal defense attorney Bob Levant. In studio with me is Dan Gross from Gross Communications. All right, Dan, biggest takeaway again from this. We've had two people with courtroom expertise. What's your biggest takeaway from this whole thing?
I agree with Bob in terms, I think it is unlikely that they would come up with the death penalty, but I also agree, taking the death penalty off the table doesn't look as black and white as, it's not as though the prosecution is saying we choose to give him life versus death, because you don't know whether the jury is actually going to convict. And I think even if the people who have been impaneled have already said, sure, I would be able, if I decided that this man was guilty, I'd be able to impose the death penalty. I think when you actually get to the stage where you realize, okay, I really am deciding whether or not this man lives or dies, I think that will probably soften a lot of people up, even if they've already said that they would be for it. So I wouldn't, as you said, how difficult it is for local juries to convict people or to give the death penalty. I think it would, I agree with you on that it would more likely be a life sentence. But I also agree with Bob that I think the state and government regulations should be the thing that changes here. I mean, we're discussing before, people have their own personal opinions and politics about abortion, and I think some of those issues have come to the table about whether things should or should not be allowed. But more importantly, the biggest takeaway is that there was years of reports about this House of Horrors.
I could certify for viewers that under Corbett, this has been followed to the book, which means you'll have one inspection a year and a random inspection. Under Tom Ridge, who for the record is a Republican, because he wanted to appear to be pro-choice, this is what turned Gosnell loose. It's shocking to me. I don't know if Ed Rendell fully knew or was cognizant of this, that for 17 years there was not one inspection of Kermit Gosnell. It is almost, we inspect everything today. I mean, from
that is shocking.
Nail salons would have gotten inspected 15 or 20 times, not something this serious. That's what is amazing.
Right.
And Ridge is the one that I point the finger at.
Well, that makes sense, but I also think, before we heap praise on Governor Corbett, don't forget he's taken office since this story has come out, and since this, so his decision to create these kind of inspections has been under the microscope of the Gosnell story, which has been out there.
First day in office, but okay, fair enough. Coming up, I want to talk about that, and are there any political repercussions of this in the governor's race coming up? And also just a couple more odds and ends around the Gosnell trial, the breaking news that he has been found guilty of 3 cases of homicide. Straight ahead on Dom Time.